I'd like to have a few minutes to share with you a bit on Dr. Albar's experience, very diverse experience at a national level as well as international level. So Tan Sri Dr. Saeed Hamid Albar has been a member of parliament and has held various ministerial positions, including Minister in the Prime Minister Department, Minister of Defense, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Minister for Home Affairs. In fact, Tan Sri just now mentioned that in his capacity as Minister of Defense during the Bosnian War and during the Kosovo War, he has actually physically himself traveled there and has seen the atrocities, has witnessed atrocities firsthand. He has held very important positions within the Malaysian banks and other important organizations. He has been OIC's former special envoy to Myanmar. His engagement, his passionate engagement with global humanitarian issues has continued until today. So Dr. Albar is the council member of the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council that is currently. He is also a founder of Humanity Malaysia, an NGO involved in humanitarian work in Malaysia and the ASEAN, and particularly in Myanmar, given the Rohingya issues there. Dr. Albar is also actively involved in the academic world. He has been a visiting fellow at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. Currently, Dr. Albar is adjunct professor in Asia University, Kuala Lumpur. So without further ado, I would like to cordially invite Dr. Albar to give his inaugural speech for this three-day event.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. First of all, Madam MC, thank you for your kind words in the introduction. Dr. Farouk, I think the head of the Jaringan Nusantara, and I think all my children in front of me, because I'm actually fairly ancient compared to all of you. So, first of all, Dr. Farouk is quite a very persuasive person. In whatever he do, is passionate, persuasive, and I think this is the second time that he asked me to participate in a program that he organized. But listening to his introduction just now on some of the things that is involved, I'm not so sure. As a former Home Minister, I would like to comment. But I think actually a person who is very active in thinking and in trying to seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge so that you can do something for the betterment of mankind is what Islam is all about. It's a religion of knowledge, it's a religion that encourages. That's why the first 5 verses is on Iqra. Iqra should not be interpreted simply as read. It is actually searching for knowledge. That's why in our case in Islam, the person who has got knowledge is put at a higher status. So Dr. Farouk only given status is higher than many of us. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say that I'm very pleased and honored to be asked to speak on a subject of that I consider very old as well as current. It's on democracy, on Islam, human rights, which is the theme of your 3 days conference. And I'm not a scholar in this field, and I see many of you are learned in this area, but I'm also not an expert on Islam, though I have knowledge of it, because I think Surin always like to tell me, you know, I started my life from the pondok. I didn't start my life from the pondok, but I nearly ended up as an ustaz, because I went first to study in the religious school in Johor. Johor has got a very good structure of religious study. It's very organized, very structured. I went there, and I'm always, ini kang ujub lah, ria. But I think I always top the class when it comes to this religious school. Then only after a while I decided I think maybe life is more challenging as an ustaz, and then I chose to be a different person and decided to study. I wouldn't call it secular, but I started to study about humanity and human beings. So that's what I am today, and everything that I do is because I'm a person who believes in destiny, very much so, that we do not determine our own life, but it is determined for us. When we just work on it, don't try to become somebody, but if you want to be somebody, but just work on it. And if God so destined for you to be that, then you will arrive there. I didn't think that I want to be a minister or an MP, though my father is from the political life. They say it's in my blood. So I was asked actually to contest. I was quite happy, earning quite a lot when I was working in the bank. I spent most of my time in the bank. And how I started to like the subject of democracy and human rights, Islam, is because I think it gives me the sense of humbleness and humility, that you are just a speck or a dot in the big ocean of everything else. So I want to talk something about it, because I think when you have the subject Islam, democracy, human rights, it's always related to something that we are talking about, Islam and the West. Immediately Islam and the West. So then this invites us, when you talk about Islam and the West, this invites us to a degree of misunderstanding that is so deep and wide in our increasingly, our divide is very deep and wide. I'm not putting the slide first. This invites a degree of misunderstanding that is deep and wide in a very paradoxical way in an increasingly globalized and interdependent world. So I think you have to interpret this in the context of human rights. Is it the intention of propagating rights, or the intention of creating hegemony, or trying to universalize standards that is hegemony, which means that it is a Western standard trying to be imposed on other people. So I think if you look at ourselves, in the case of Islam, just now when I started, I think Dr. Farooq started the same way, I also started the same way. You know, every time when I went to the first time, I was a Minister of Defense, but I can tell you, when I went to Kosovo, I started to cry what I saw. So it is, you know, it is a feeling that is, I think all of us, when we started to speak, if you are Muslim, you say Assalamu alaikum. Say Assalamu alaikum. And this Assalamu alaikum, I think, extend. People tend to think that it extends only to Muslims, but Assalamu alaikum in this context, to all Muslim friends as well as strangers. And this is the very essence of the teachings of Islam. You greet, in the first place, unqualified submission to the will of God, and you offer peace to all. And a religion that starts with that type of approach or methodology of introducing yourself with Assalamu alaikum cannot be a religion that is against human rights, against the freedom of the individual. That means it recognizes that it is. So as you are aware, Islam, Dr. Farooq is quite controversial with all kinds of things. He invites very interesting people. So I'm not as daring as he is, even though I was a Minister of Defense. I'm fairly circumscribed in what I do in order to make sure that my intention of contributing and doing service is not going to stop halfway. Because you must make sure in your struggle, whatever you do, like now trying to establish the Jaringan Nusantara or the Nusantara network, it is important that it survives. It is important that the networking is expanded and grow further. So I think, as all of you are aware, Islam is the, you can call the youngest of all religions, or the newest of all the religions, revealed religion. And it is, I think, and I have the, you see, I'm very ignorant about playing with this. You see, I've just completed my thesis on Ibn Khaldun. That's why you see that my introduction is on Ibn Khaldun. The inner meaning of history involves speculation. And unfortunately, in our case, we allow the speculation that is not based on truth. So we read our history from the jaundiced viewpoint of our colonial masters. So in this case, it's an attempt to get to the truth, while a subtle explanation of the causes and origins of existing things and deep knowledge of the how and why of events. I think this is it's all about it. It is important for us to know that. And Islam, when it was revealed to humanity as the so Islam revealed to humanity as a guide to human being, as a way of life. In the first place, I find it difficult when you try to relate Islam. There is concepted under divine message from God with an ideology that is concepted by human beings. Definitely is not comparing apple to apple. We are talking about two different things. But here, the religion say it is inna dina indallahi al-Islam. Islam is a way of life. The deen is a way of life. And the way of life to guide us to spread good and avoid evil. There is the simple, basic knowledge. And I think Muhammad Iqbal has got the right approach. You see, when you want to look at Islam and democracy, or Islam and human rights, you have to see the distinguishing part about Islam and human rights, because Islam contains in it ethical and political aspects. The political aspect, you are given the flexibility to do your own framework of it. So we see the Constitution of Medina. The first written constitution in the history of man is done other than the one that is done in Iraq on the law of the. So I think it's ethical also, moral and ethical values. So I think if you look at all religions concern with man and universe. You look at it, it's concerned man and universe. How we manage, termasuk perempuan. I think the word men sometimes in the today's context we say that we are prejudiced. So I better say that it includes everyone. So women is never excluded because women is part of men. If you are a conventional interpreter of how God creates human beings from Adam, kan? Jadi kita in this case is concerned with universe. Islam looks upon the universe as a reality. If you look at Buddhism, say for example, Buddhism say that the nature is of pain and suffering. If you look at Christianity, it talks about we are all born sinners. Therefore, there must be atonement. of the sinners through the salvation through Jesus. In the case of Islam, it says, it contains sin, it contains pain, it contains sorrow, and in this direction it is real. There is no such thing. It's real. I'm not trying to preach, because I don't preach to the people who already know. But I'm giving my point of view of how I look at all these things. So Islam look at the universe. Evil is not essential. It's not essential. If you are born a sinner, then evil is part of it. I mean, it is essential. In the case of Islam, it is not essential to the universe. Now, surely, God, and this is in the Quran, chapter 10, the ayat 66. Now, surely, whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth is Allah's. The verses of the Quran, when read together with the tradition, indicates that, according to the tenet of Islam, man is essentially not born a sinner. There is a tradition of the Prophet, you are born as white, as clean, and you color it, whether you want the color to be black, green, white, you put the color into it, what you are going to become. So, this indicates that the tenet of Islam meant essentially good and peaceful. If you remember the way that why Iblis could not understand why God creates Adam, because he's going, even Malaikat asked God, this man that is created by you is going to create all the problems in the world. And I think true now, today, it is true, they are creating all the problems in the world. If you look at the current modern political thought, what Islam has preached is that, in the case of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in modern political thought, he takes the same position in terms of the nature of man. So that's how I look at it. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, so we should pay attention. This I borrow from Iqbal. We should pay attention to the Islamic ideals in its ethical and political aspects. To me, this is our discourse, and this is our subject. Every great religion system starts with the concern of man and universe. As I mentioned, Islam looks upon the universe differently. The verses of the Quran, when read together with the tradition, indicates that, according to the tenets of Islam, we are not born as sinners. So Iqbal says, Islam transvaluates the moral values of the ancient world. In this sense, man is free. And this is where we are supposed to be. We are free, responsible being. We are the maker of our own destiny, and our salvation is our own business. There is no, we always end up saying that this is taqdeer. God has, but taqdeer you do not know, so you must work as it is without, if you do not know what it's going to be. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ declared the principle of equality. I was reading the Magna Carta. If you read some of the writing up, they say Magna Carta is the first Bill of Rights to human being. It was given, and then it talks about control of parliament and taxation. I think if the drafter of the Magna Carta was alive, if we make that type of conclusion, they will be surprised because they never talk about that. And Islam, which is a religion of 700 years before the Magna Carta, has already talked about equality of men. So if you, so I think it's, so as far as the Prophet is concerned, I think for the first time, we see that a Prophet of Allah is sent as a social reformer. Why? I think it attracts all kind of political ideology as a social reformer. And I think he recognized the social condition of his environment and society that he lived in, and the spirit. Say, for example, I was reading, I think Dr. Farouk's slides. Some of the quotation, they say Islam is against human rights, because it encourages slavery. You look at the tradition of the Prophet, you look at the Quranic tenets, all the Quranic verses, there is nothing that say that we encourage slavery. But we have to recognize at that time there was such a thing, and as slavery. But there is also an encouragement on our from for us, for the Muslims, to make sure you are rewarded if you free the slave. So I think, he does it by example. In the case of, he cannot abolish slavery, but he says that the slaves have equal opportunities. There is no greater human right than that. Has equal opportunities as others. And if you look at the history of Islam, a lot of Muslim warriors are slaves. They were slaves. A lot of kings also start from slaves. And premiers, scholars, and jurists were slaves. To me, this is the democratic ideal of perfect equality. If you look at it, perfect. So Dr. Abru Aman, I was reading his article. He says that man is born free, and I think this one is stating the obvious. No restriction shall be made on his right to liberty except in the due process of law. Every individual and every person has the immutable right to freedom in all its forms, physical, cultural, economic, and political. We have in the Quran, La ikrahu fid din. But don't translate this in our context so openly and freely, because there is, Islam is, according to Professor Osman Bakar, there is universalism in Islam as well as particularism in Islam. Universalism, that it transcends everything, but at the same time, there are differences in terms of experiences and cultural things. So you have, so I think to freedom, our right to have freedom. So I think the Prophet liked to, this is where, because I'm using my observation and experience as a foreign minister, as a minister for over 20 years. You see, a lot of the principles, statements, and declarations are beautiful in words, but it is disappointing in action. You look at the context of today. I'm a member, a patron of the Association for the Protection Against Crime, Atrocities Crime, that is based in Australia, in the University of Queensland. And we find that R2P, right to protection, and human rights is entrenched in the UN and international system. If it is entrenched in the international UN system, but in terms of its implementation, to make sure this can be translated to reality, it is subject to double standard and selectivity. So at the end of it, you look in the case of the Middle East, say for example, when they say that there is crime, genocide, crime against humanity, or ethnic cleansing of some sort, they come in very quickly. In the case of Bosnia, actually I went to Bosnia when the war was still on, and sometime when I visited this site, this war-torn site, I think the people who brought me in the area to visit some of the areas, they don't advise us of the danger. Sometimes I walk on the, on the grass in the area, and then after I have come out of it, they say, there is some unexplored, you shouldn't have walked there. But I say, why didn't you tell me before I walked on it? The same thing that I went through and walked through the rubbles of the war between Israel and Lebanon, between Hezbollah, and I was walking, going happily, so I think there's so much of the, so but I take the philosophy of my old man, Allah yarham. He said, don't worry about death. And how you're going to die, because you do not know. If it is so distinct that you're going to die this way, you will die this way. So that's why I take if I visit something, I will do, I will ignore my own. And now I like to go back. The difference between words, there is the letter of the declaration or the letter of the charter. You look at the United Nations, just now 30 articles mentioned by Professor Farouk, that the articles is together with the Chapter 6, Chapter 7, Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, which allows for action to be taken. But at the same time, you have got the Security Council, and the permanent member of the Security Council has got a right of veto. We want to do right to protection. Right to protection, it means that no state can do harm or damage. And this is human rights to its own citizens or people in their state. But in order to do that, you must get the approval of the Security Council. If the security recently, there was a resolution against Myanmar, to take action against Myanmar, but it was stopped by Russia, China. So at the end of it, when you are discussing human rights or democracy, you don't look at try to compare Islam, democracy, human rights, whether we have not. It is the geopolitical consideration that is the most important. If we do not consider the geopolitical thing, then our action or our decision will not fulfill what we want. The Prophet, as I say, he translates. Say, for example, in the case of slavery, he wants to show that slaves have got equal opportunities. He asked one of his relatives from a Quraysh tribe, very high tribe, to marry a slave. Also, I think, black slave. They don't like, but it was a prophet that asked, marry, but it was not a happy marriage, it was divorce. There was a divorce. Because of that, divorce, when you have a divorced woman, in the Arab society of that time, you don't marry a divorced woman. But now it's quite popular. So, you see that the Prophet married her himself. And you cannot propagate or advocate something if you yourself not willing to do it. So I think this is what is most important to us. So he married himself, and the European critic of Islam, say that the meaning of this, they do not know how to translate this meaning of the Prophet's action due to prejudice, ignorance, or want of insight. You look at what Mahmoud Munshi-Puri and Christopher G. Kukla, I think, in a pragmatic form, say that, if there is any attempt to hegemonize, or you want to hegemonize, it will marginalize or disparage the Islamic perspectives of human rights, the social justice and democracy in the name of making universal in the Muslim world practices which are essentially Western liberality. Its origin is Western liberalism, and this will render uncertain the future prospect of peace and stability in these countries. We have seen that when regime change, the concept of regime change was to make it democratic, to make sure they practice human rights, ultimately the country is destroyed. You see what happened in the case of Libya. See what happened in the case of Iraq. See what happened now in the case of Syria. Under international law and international norms, a state is recognized to have sovereign right. But you cannot, in real term, you cannot be providing arms or funding in order to create a regime change on the ground that, the state is not democratic. When you talk about democracy, democracy is not monolithic. Neither is Islam monolithic. As if you look at the Surah Rum, and Surah Hujarat, is very clear. God says, I create languages and sort of thing, difference, so that we begin to recognize that. So I think, let me now, how many minutes more have I got? So such effort described, Charles Amjad Ali says that this is a pseudo-universalizing. It poses a direct challenge to Islamic political, moral, legal orders. Islam recognizes complete freedom of religion and belief for every human being. That's the religion of Islam. I think just now, I think Dr. Farooq quoted that about the last speech of the Prophet, the sermon, O ye men, O ye human, Ya ayyuhan nas, call. That there is, in order to set the footing of human rights, equality before the law on everyone. So we have got, I think, something that is important to us. So I hope that we should, when we are discussing about democracy and human rights, let us look at it in terms of its historical basis and experience of particular people. Let us not just say, you must introduce this and it must be done this way. And they would have a completely different history and experience. The democracy in Malaysia, we have been calling Malaysia a democratic country. So North Korea also calling itself democratic country. Now Vietnam also is a democratic country. Laos is also in a democratic country. I think it's very difficult. You get 99% voting when it comes to, almost. So we need to see the context in which it is discussed and put. So I would say that Islam, my view is that Islam is a political ideal, and we must always practice, in my view, something that is encouraged in Islam. Two things I think that is very important in Islam. Why Islam grows and it's able to grow very well because of the Renaissance and Tajdid. Renewal. All the time we have to make renewal in our case because things keep on changing. That's why in the religion of Islam, if you look at the Quran, it has got a lot of stories. The stories is the best form for us to take example from, but it doesn't have many edicts. It doesn't have many laws to allow us to adjust in accordance to the need of the time. So Western critique of those trained, I'm sorry if I criticize those trained in the Western socio-political and philosophical thought, do not agree with me to such a proposition that Islam is a political ideal. And I was looking at it, many in the Western world, and I think recently I read a book by, I forgot her name. She is a Jew, she's a scholar, a Jew, a historian, and an agnostic. And she talks about, she says, there is an ayat in the Quran, which I have looked, that people used to say that Islam is the religion of the sword and violence. When we still hear, until today we are hearing it. In fact, if we look at the ayat, it says that we are not allowed to go to war except for defensive purposes. And it's permitted in the Quran only for defensive purposes. The doctrine of aggressive war against the unbelievers is wholly unauthorized by the Quran. It's dalam chapter 3, ayat 19. All the wars. And then if you study, it's better for us to look at it and to put it contextually. If you study all the wars during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, were defensive. For example, in 628, he declared war against the Roman Empire. And this is it started because the special envoy of the Prophet to Constantinople was killed. Islam introduced the first concept of diplomacy. It's not Italy or France The Prophet writes letters to invite people to Islam and send envoys to ask them to become a Muslim. So, even in the case of defensive war, we have already got the rule of war, the War Convention of Islam, which says that you are forbidden to do wanton cruelties to the vanquished. So, ladies and gentlemen, it sounds like preaching, you know. But I don't preach to those who are already learned in the area. So the other thing I just want to mention before I sit down is if you look at our history, the history of Islam, the expansion of Islam as a religion. If you are not, if you are a religion against freedom, if you are a religion against human rights, the expansion of Islam is not related to the power of its followers. This can be seen if you look at the spiritual conquest of Islam, it came at a time of decline of the Muslim empires. For example, in 1258, the Mongolian destroyed and caused a lot of bloodshed in Baghdad. And then the fall of Muslim Spain, it is different from the other. The fall of Muslim Spain. The followers of Islam were mercilessly killed and driven out of Cordoba in 1236 by Ferdinand. In fact, according to some history book, I think Ferdinand committed one of the worst crimes of genocide. It's about 10 million were killed during the siege of Andalusia, Cordoba. And then Islam secured a footing in Sumatra. Look, that's why his Jaringan is very important. We have got a lot to learn. And Jaringan, Nusantara is important. Islam secured a footing in Sumatra and began the peaceful conversion of the Malay archipelago, not through the sword of violence. And then if you look at the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century and the Mongols in the 13th century that I mentioned just now, both the Seljuk Turks and the Mongols, ultimately they became Muslims. They followed the religion of the conquered. So Arnold Toynbee, if you look at a great historian Arnold Toynbee, he says that Islam has achieved some of the most brilliant conquests at a time of its political decline. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will try to rush it. Oh, dah tak jalan lah. Ni dah mati lah. So anyway, see, sometimes I boleh? Okay. So I think I just like to repeat and to say that Islam has gained its greatest and most lasting climb in time places in which its political power has been weakest. For example, this because I take the thing from Iqbal. He quoted the example of South India and Eastern Bengal at the time. Then, therefore, in truth, it is essentially a religion of peace. The ideal of Islam is to secure social peace at any cost. Bukhari, in the hadith of Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ said, even if a Negro slave is appointed to rule over you, listen to him and obey him. So it is something where we are going wrong now, because we are not able to show. At present, people are looking not at the religion, people looking at its followers. The followers are no longer exemplary. The followers are not something that you want to follow, and people tend to associate it with the religion. Islam is something more than a creed, it is also a community, a nation. And since the beginning of history, man has committed all kinds of misery and cruelties and violation of rights. So ladies and gentlemen, now I will go to my conclusion. Because this guy was very disappointed with the international system. Therefore, when you want to talk about human rights, I hope we are not taking it from a narrow perspective. This is no rights to the women. I think when I studied law in UK, the women, once you get married in UK, in the English legal system, you acquire the name of your husband or the family name of your husband. And at that time, it was very popular for men to look for a rich woman because all the properties of the woman will belong to the man. And it's only in the 19th century, mid-19th century, that they started to change. But in Islam, you retain your own name, but now most of the Muslim countries, if you look at Middle East or even I think in Europe, most of the Muslim women would acquire the name of the husband following, rather than Western thing. So rights, I think for Islam, human rights are not taken from a narrow perspective, but incorporates the wider perspective of rights of all creations of Allah. Rights are not simply an ideological precept as concepted by man, but Islam derives its significance from the moral and spiritual values. Say for example, if you look at same-sex marriage, LGBT, and adultery, Islam takes a different route entirely. So if you start to compare this one, therefore there is no human right, then there is, I think it's not right. So ladies and gentlemen, I have just touched on some aspect of the rights, and as to be brief as possible to the subject presented before you. And now, as I mentioned just now, let us look at the most important concept in Islam. There is anything that you want to do, there must be justice, there must be ihsan. You must have justice. Establishing justice is the law of Allah. It is partly the balance which Allah has created, as mentioned in Surah Ar-Rahman. Weigh all things with justice and fall not short of the measure. This means Allah has created the balance of justice in the world. We are not permitted to transgress the system of balance. We are the middle path. We are created as the middle path. I think Dr. Farooq has now mentioned to me, you want to find the middle ground. I think the middle ground is wasatiyah, middle ground. Ummatan wasatan. It's a middle ground that we say. Justice is a core principle and the basis of all rights, interwoven with measure, balance, and order of the universe. In the event that we violate rights in one area, we'll violate rights in other areas and disturb the order and balance of the universe. So when let us discuss human rights in the case of Islam in the context to the notion, let us relate it to the notion of justice, harmony, and order in the universe. So if we look at that, then we will not feel that we have done. There is no such thing as arrogance because of your nationality or you have got national concept. Islam has already introduced globalization, the concept of the ummah, but today we don't have any ummah. So in conclusion, the best form of government would be democracy, in my view, the ideal of which is to let man develop all the possibilities by allowing him as much freedom as practicable. But I have got a different interpretation of freedom. Freedom is not ad infinitum. There is no limit to freedom, because Farooq is a scientist. You know that everything has got a limit. I always say that you have got your freedom, but to move, to leave your hand. But your freedom, if you raise your hand and it touches my face, then you have already breached your right to freedom, because I have already affected the right of others. So Islamic concept of human rights is comprehensive and compact, practicable, because it has proposition and balance. It has proportion and balance between rights and duties. You cannot only be talking about rights, you must be talking about duties and obligations. The weakness of the United Nations, the international order, is like the United Nations has no enforcement ability. It can make decisions, but it cannot enforce its decision. There is no central authority that to govern its enforcement or punish. Like people say, why can't ASEAN, I hear still a lot, why can't ASEAN expel or suspend Myanmar. You look at the charter of the ASEAN Charter, there is no such thing as suspend. So you have to tolerate Myanmar. And the worst part of ASEAN is that there is non-interference, there is sovereignty. So non-interference, there is, I think, interpreted in the worst form possible. So this has given rise to many confusion and misunderstanding. The divine command of equality and dignity can be fully implemented. There will be no room for oppression or suppression. Islam respects human being for being a human. Islam does not distinguish between races or two groups or people, between colors or tribes or classes. All are equal in the sight of Allah. The system of feudalism, the system of whatever system you have, are all created by us. Whether it denies our human rights or not, because we give the approval to the system to exist based on our own tradition. So ladies and gentlemen, terima kasih banyak. Thank you very much. I hope I made it worth your while to listen, and if there is anything wrong or any shortfall, it is because of my own shortcomings and weaknesses. Sekian. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.